The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. My stepdad Carl hates me. There's just no other way to put it. "Matt, if you don't like it, go and live with your dad," Carl would yell, squinting at me through his wire-rimmed glasses, arms folded. "I don't know where he is, though. I don't know him. He left when I was 7, I'd reply. "That's not my problem, is it? I'm the breadwinner in this household, so if you want to live here, you'll do as I say." The chore schedule is strict. Sweeping, doing the dishes, washing the car, dusting, vacuuming. Invariably, Carl would find some fault with the quality of my work and call a house meeting to make clear that the piece of gravel he found on the kitchen floor was not acceptable. Had I even done the chores at all? Or was I lying? My mum would sit there, eyes downcast, letting him get through his spiel. Evie, his daughter, my stepsister, would hover by the doorway, waiting to dash out of the room when he'd had his say. I learned long ago that there is no way to win the argument, so I'm deferential and apologize, and say it'll never happen again. But it will. When he's out at his job as a mobile mechanic, I say as much to my mum, and she's well aware. He has his flaws, but he's practical, and in his heart he's good. He's been the closest thing you've had to a father, Matt. He took that responsibility when he didn't have to. She'd say soothingly, "In your heart you're good, but you don't treat Evie like he treats me." I'd respond, "Evie has a mother who shares the burden. It isn't my fault my dad ran away." That's how the conversation goes, around and around in circles. In fairness, my stepdad can be a dick to Evie too. He restricts our internet access. He doesn't let us have sugary snacks. He makes us lock our phones away in a cupboard at 9 p.m. sharp and sends us to bed. He bangs on the bathroom door if he deems we've been in the shower too long. As a result, Evie and I have bonded. The austere rules push us together, and we've got a genuine friendship. She appreciates that I'm more hard done by, so she'll smuggle me biscuits and tell me the Wi-Fi password. If she's managed to weasel the information out of Carl. Needless to say, the rules are subject to a degree of flexibility. He buys chocolate biscuits and Doritos for himself and can munch a whole bag in a night, spilling crumbs over the sofa he's sprawled out on. I can hear the TV blaring till midnight sometimes, the drone being broken only by his guffaws. Strict and baleful as he is, he has never laid a finger on any of us. Instead, he smashes objects and writes notes in a capitalized font on the back of envelopes for me to discover in a morning. He screams and shouts in my face, sending the sour stench of his breath my way. I wonder if he's trying to provoke me to hit him, which would be absurd. He's pushing 2 meters tall and heavy set, and I'm a skinny 17-year-old who's far more interested in reading about battles than fighting them. I'm used to his dramatic outbursts now, so that's why yesterday was so weird. Carl was trying to fix the pipes under the kitchen sink, while Evie pressed him for extra pocket money. He was grumbling and largely ignoring her, until she mentioned something about the chest in the basement. Carl stopped his tinkering and slid out from under the counter. He towered over Evie, ominously silent. I was studying at the kitchen table, but stopped to watch. Carl's face, usually so snarling and pained when he was angry, was utterly blank. "What did you say?" he whispered. I was just joking. I said I could sell that old chest in the basement to get some pocket money. I'll say this once, Evie. You leave my chest alone." His eyes, cold as frozen planets, bore into Evie's for a moment longer. Then he went back to work. Evie left the room, sobbing. I followed her up to her bedroom, where she was crying into one of her old teddies. I thought I'd be doing him a favor. It's full of his army clothes. People buy that sort of stuff nowadays, don't they? And it'd clear some space. I was trying to be nice. I put my arm around her. "I know, Evie," I said. 2 years younger than me and less beaten down, Evie's heart was more open to assault. Still, the coldness of Carl's fury had shocked me. "Fuck him! Fuck him! Fuck him!" she screamed into her teddy. "Say, Evie, shall we see what's in Carl's chest tonight, 3 a.m? She looked at me with vengeful, red-rimmed eyes and nodded. I played on her heightened emotions a little, I'll admit, but the way Carl reacted had me genuinely worried about what he had in that chest. If it was anything that could endanger my mum or Evie, I had to know. The evening passed. Evie and I completed our chores, and I read for an hour before surrendering my mobile phone. I said goodnight to Carl and my mum, and only got one response. It's not worth pointing out who ignored me and who replied. I climbed the stairs and closed my bedroom door. It was far too early to sleep, despite what Carl thought, so I read by lamplight every night until my eyes got tired. The only thing to be wary of were slow, creaking noises that might indicate Carl was creeping up the stairs. Reading in bedrooms was also banned, and publicly, neither me nor Evie did it. However, Carl had his suspicions, so he'd climb with stealth to a certain point on the stairs to check for a glow beneath either of our bedroom doors. If he saw light, he'd burst into the room hoping to catch us. Therefore, I'd preemptively switch off the lamp and pretend to be asleep at the sound of any unusual noise. Once a military man, always a military man, I guess. Carl had spent a decade in the army as an engineer. He'd been deployed multiple times, but never to an active theatre of war. Bowing to his ex-wife's demands, he'd returned to civilian life a year after Evie's birth. Everything I'd been able to glean seemed to indicate Carl had enjoyed his time in the military. The problem is that he never talks about it. He smiles absently, and his eyes go somewhere far away. What had he seen? What had he done? I woke to a gentle tapping at the door. It was time. "Follow my steps," Evie whispered. She'd charted the least creaky path down the stairs, it seemed. We reached the stone slabs of the kitchen floor and gently opened the basement door, careful of squealing hinges. I closed the door behind us and turned on the flickering light. Pressing against the dusty, cobweb-ridden walls, we descended. The basement itself was cramped and filled with tools, shelves, bicycles, shoes, boxes. Evie pulled a picnic blanket off of a bulky mass to reveal a mahogany chest that was curiously dust-free. "He comes down here most nights, you know," she said. "Why?" Evie shrugged and nudged a coded padlock. "Shit, do you know the code?" I said. "Maybe," Evie said, before twisting 4 numbers into the padlock. It clicked open. "Ha! Dad's army serial number. It's full of army crap, so I assumed that'd be it." "How do you know it's full of army crap?" I asked. "He told me once, duh. Or at least I think he did. Let's open it and find out." The lid was heavier than we expected. It was 4 inches thick and must have been full of lead. I heaved at one side and Evie heaved at the other until we got it up. Inside there were no combat fatigues, no dog tags, no boots. It was empty, except for 2 objects, a long black cushion and a human jawbone. "Who's there?" Evie and I stared at each other, then back at the jawbone. "Boy, girl, speak." "Can you hear a voice?" I asked Evie. "Yeah. This isn't army stuff. I don't know what this is." I heard a hollow laugh before the voice continued. "He wouldn't have told you about me, his charnel confidant. Such is his shame, for he slew me long ago upon a field far from here." "I don't like it," Evie said. "Who killed you?" I asked the bone. "Her father." "My dad wouldn't kill anyone, that's a lie," Evie wailed. "Shh, you'll wake them," I whispered. "I don't like this. He comes here every night to pray and beg and weep, just as his spawn does. He's certain it was an accident, a firing range mishap, nothing more. Do you believe him? Might he do it again?" "I hate this," Evie said, and went to close the lid, but I held her back, chewing my lip. "Are we in danger?" I asked, and that chilly laugh rattled through my head again. Evie broke my grip and lunged for the jawbone perched on the black cushion. "You dare to touch me!" The chest lid slammed shut on Evie's right arm, halfway along the bicep, shattering the bone. She let out half a scream before passing out and sliding down the side of the chest. A grisly, grinding sound came from her trapped arm as it twisted further. A cold sweat burst out all over my body and I sprang into action, heaving Evie back up from where she'd fallen. "Let her out! Let her out!" The voice had ceased to reply. Summoning all my strength, I squatted down and pressed the lid up. It didn't budge. I adjusted my grip and pushed with everything I had. A dark centimeter grew into 2, then 3, then 4. I glimpsed that grinning bone perched on black velvet before Evie's mangled arm was free, and she slid back onto the basement floor. I let the lid thud shut. I helped her up the basement stairs, fully intending to wake my mum and Carl up because Evie needed to go to hospital. She was delirious and muttering. When we emerged, she looked at me, her face white as chalk. "Run up the stairs, I was sleepwalking, I fell," she said. It took me a moment to realize what she was doing. Carl would question my role in his daughter's injury. Despite her agony, she'd hatched a plan to protect me from his wrath. I nodded and stamped up the stairs as loud as I could before dashing into my bedroom and closing the door. I leapt into bed just as Evie started yelling from the foot of the stairs. Today has been quiet with everyone at the hospital. At some point I'll go into the basement and cover the chest with the picnic blanket and sweep some dust around to hide any footprints. I just don't feel like it yet. I'm quite happy rocking back and forth on my bed for now, thinking, what the fuck happened last night? We had an uncle, Cooper, and would occasionally visit his family, though they usually came to our place. There was always something unsettling about them. They gave off a chilling vibe I could never quite explain. Aunt Anna, in particular, always told strange stories. Stories I could never tell if they were meant as jokes or rooted in some disturbing truth. There was something fundamentally off about her and my older cousin, Alyssa. The younger brother, Sam, seemed fine. Maybe he was too young to be tainted by whatever was wrong with the rest of the family. Uncle Cooper always seemed distant, like he was moving through life in a daze. One day they shared another eerie tale, this time about a little boy gasping for breath while his parents stood by, smiling. It gave me goosebumps. There was always something in their stories, a sense of truth that made them even more terrifying. Days passed, and I had almost forgotten about it when, out of the blue, we received an invitation to dinner at their place. It was a large gathering with 4 to 5 other families. Out of courtesy, my parents accepted. So, on a Friday night, my parents, my older brother Paul and I went over. Uncle Peter and Aunt Nina, 2 of the kindest people I knew, were also there. As we entered, they gave each of us a necklace with a large stone attached to it. We assumed it was a simple gesture of hospitality, nothing out of the ordinary in the city. Everything seemed normal at first. The adults mingled, drinks were poured, and people chatted. I didn't know many of the guests, but it felt like just another social event. Uncle Cooper had a large lawn outside, and as the evening went on, more and more people, including my parents and Paul, moved outside to smoke. It was winter, and a thick fog had settled, making it hard to see anything out there. The necklace I was wearing began to feel heavy, so I handed it to Aunt Nina for safekeeping and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when I saw something through the kitchen window. Someone was gasping for breath outside, while Alyssa watched with a sinister smile on her face. It was as if she was somehow controlling him. Fear gripped me. I tried to run back inside, but Alyssa saw me and gave me the creepiest smile. Panicking, I rushed into the living room, hoping to find someone, anyone, but the room was nearly empty. The only person left was Uncle Peter, who was clearly a bit tipsy. I told him what I had seen, but he didn't take me seriously, probably assuming I was just being paranoid like a typical teenager. We went outside to check, but the moment I stepped out, I couldn't breathe. It was like something was suffocating me. We rushed back inside, and suddenly I could breathe again. Uncle Peter still thought I was overreacting. I asked him where Aunt Nina was because deep down I had a gut feeling that I needed that necklace to go outside. Uncle Peter called Aunt Nina on her cell, who said she had left the necklace on the table in the living room. But something was off. Nina would never have just stayed outside if she thought I was scared. Uncle Peter started to sense it too. We frantically searched for the necklace when Aunt Anna, Uncle Cooper, and Alyssa walked in, their faces twisted into sinister smiles. Aunt Anna touched Uncle Peter lightly, and his entire demeanor shifted. His eyes went blank, and suddenly he wasn't in control anymore. He grabbed a knife and started walking toward me. Terrified, I backed away as Uncle Peter advanced, all while Aunt Anna, Uncle Cooper, and Alyssa watched in silence. In a fake, eerie voice, Peter asked Cooper, "What are you doing, Peter? Are you okay, Nicole?" But I knew something was horribly wrong. I managed to dodge Peter's attack and ran, frantically searching for the necklace. When I finally found it, I grabbed it and dashed outside. What I saw outside was chaos. 6 bodies lay scattered across the lawn. It looked like some twisted version of the Hunger Games. Desperate, I searched for my parents and brother, but they were nowhere to be found. I fled into a nearby deserted street, calling for my mum, dad, and Paul. Eventually, I heard my mum's voice calling for me. When we found each other, she hugged me tightly. She had a wound on her head, but seemed otherwise fine. I asked where Dad and Paul were, and she said they had gone looking for me while she hid in one of the empty houses. We rushed back into the house, but doing so seemed to reveal our location to whoever was hunting us. I asked my mum what was happening, but she simply told me to be quiet and warned me not to trust anyone, not even Dad or Paul, and to never, under any circumstances, let Cooper's family touch me. Just then, we heard the door creak open. It was Sam, crying softly and asking if we were there. He seemed scared and confused, saying his parents were acting strange. My mum, despite my pleas, couldn't resist her motherly instinct. She asked me to stay hidden and bolt if anything goes wrong. Alyssa was waiting outside, and just as my mum revealed herself, Alyssa entered the house. Horrified, I slipped out the fire exit, leaving my mum behind and feeling helpless and alone. I found Paul not long after, or rather, he found me. He came out of nowhere and attacked me, choking me. Desperate, I grabbed at everything around me, including his necklace, which snapped off. As soon as it did, Paul stopped choking me and seemed like himself again, but he started suffocating like I had before. I quickly put the necklace back on him, and he returned to normal. That's when we realized that the necklaces were somehow protecting us, breaking whatever spell was controlling them. We needed to find our parents and escape. Fortunately, Mum found us, but Dad was still missing. After another near-deadly encounter, Mum decided we had to leave immediately. We ran for the car, but when we reached it, Alyssa, Peter, Anna, and even little Sam were already waiting for us. We barely made it to the car. As Mum turned on the ignition, Aunt Anna called out to Paul, and just from glancing back at her, he changed. He started attacking Mum, smashing her head against the steering wheel. It had all been a trap. Paul had never truly been free from their control. In a panic, I grabbed the pepper spray my mum had given me and sprayed it into Paul's eyes. We managed to shove him out of the car and sped off, leaving the horror behind us. But no investigation was ever done. No one believed our story. We moved far away, but even now, at 18, I'm still haunted by what happened that night. The scars may have healed, but the memories never will. When I was 8 years old, my family moved away from our busy home in the city to a small, sleepy town in the countryside. My dad had gotten a new job, you see, at the nuclear power plant. The plant loomed over the town, its chimneys coughing out thick smoke onto the houses. Our homes almost seemed like an afterthought, protruding from the side of the plant like a sudden growth when its creators realized too late that their workers would need somewhere to live. We lived on Strand Street, to the east of Building A. Although it was long ago now, I still remember the day we moved very clearly. As soon as we came into view of the towers, the air seemed to feel heavy. It was as if a damp, thick blanket had been pulled up over me, pressing down on my shoulders. When I took a labored breath, my mouth filled with an odd, chemical taste. I rolled up my window. The sun was only just beginning to set. We'd been rushing around all day, trying to cram the last of our things into the car, and yet the town was deserted. I pressed my face against the glass to try and peer into the windows of houses as we drove past, but it didn't seem like anyone was home at all. Each window pane was fully covered from the inside, not allowing even a speck of light to poke through. "I'm sure there'll be lots of other children in our street, Charlie," said my mum, seeming to read my mind. She turned around, squeezing my hand. I tried to smile. "That's our house right there," chimed Dad, pointing to a small brick house at the end of the terrace. As he tried his best to park on the narrow road, I noticed a couple walking very quickly past us, carrying grey shopping bags. They glanced behind them every now and then, as if they were being followed by something only they could see. They finally stopped at a house just a few doors down from ours, and the woman let out a breath she'd been holding. She then began to point towards us and whisper something to the man, who was already staring worriedly at my parents as they unpacked the car. I hopped out and stood close to my dad, who was enthusiastically shaking the man's hand and introducing us. My dad was the type of person who could quickly become friends with anyone he met, whether they wanted to or not. The man, Mr. Grieg, looked a little uncomfortable and began glancing over his shoulder again. Mrs. Grieg wrung her hands together and began to talk to my parents when she was suddenly interrupted by a knock on their window. Inside, a boy about my age was poking his head through the thick curtains as if he was searching for something. He looked down at me and broke into a wide grin, showing off a missing front tooth. As quickly as he appeared, the window was now empty, and we heard thundering footsteps from inside the house. Mrs. Grieg turned on her heel and almost ran towards the house in an attempt to herd the boy back in. He came flying down the street nevertheless, almost bowling me over. "I'm Toby," he said, barely waiting for me to introduce myself before asking about the book in my hand and talking a mile a minute about how he had just started reading that series too, and what was my favourite character, and had I got to the really scary bit. The Griegs stood on looking nervous, and my mum gently shooed Toby and I indoors to go and find my new room. As I followed Toby and listened to his excited chatter echoing around our empty house, I looked back to see the Griegs talking in hushed tones to my parents. The smile had worn off my dad's face, and him and my mum now had the same look of fear I had just seen on Toby's parents. My mum had told me weeks before, when my dad had gotten his job, that the move would take some getting used to. Some things were easier than others. I loved having my own room. There was so much more space to play than in our little flat. Even the new junior school didn't seem so scary, now that I would have Toby by my side in September. But some things took a little longer to take in. Toby and I could spend hours happily playing in the road, kicking round an old football or running about being pirates. But each day when the sun began to set, our mothers would appear on the doorstep and hurriedly call us inside. My mum wasn't quite on the same level as Toby's yet. Mrs. Grieg seemed to permanently hover behind her door, just waiting for an alarm to go off in her head so she could call him in. Toby, on the other hand, wasn't fazed at all about the curfew. When he heard his mum call, he would roll his eyes before smiling at me and jumping up from the patch of pavement serving as our ship and jogging off to his house. For me and my mum, however, the routine felt strange. My mum had always been caring to me, of course, but had never seemed half as worried when we lived in the city. I could spend all day in the park across the road reading my book on the swings, only coming in for dinner once it had already gone dark. But now she would look almost scared as she waited for me to walk the short distance to our house, her frown only easing once I was inside with the door shut. My dad would return home a little while later, walking alongside Mr. Grieg after they finished their workday. Dad slid a bolt on the door when he came in. We'd close all the curtains and then sit and eat our dinner, accompanied by the ever-present humming of the plant. A few weeks later, I was almost used to our strange new routine. Something which did still get to me, however, was the noise. Even though I was used to the bustle of the city with all the traffic and people, there was something different about the noise of the plant. It wasn't even a constant humming. On the days when the acrid smoke was at its thickest, it was a grinding, groaning, booming screech that made the ground shake slightly. I mentioned this to Toby, who held his hand up to his ear and said, "Oh yeah," as if he was hearing it for the first time. "I guess you get used to it after a while. We've been here a year now. Maybe if you're here a year, you won't hear it either," he reassured me. "I don't know how you couldn't hear it. It's everywhere, even in my house," I lamented. Toby thought for a while, and then spoke again in an uncharacteristically quiet voice. "Well, there is somewhere where you can't hear it, but it's quite far away," he added hurriedly, already seeing the smile on my face. So far, I hadn't ventured further than a couple streets away. I felt cooped up, and just wanted to explore. "It's still very bright though, isn't it?" I asked him, looking up at the sky. Toby looked at his dinosaur watch, up to the sky, and to my hopeful face in quick succession. "I'm sure we've got time," he decided. "Let's go." Toby led the way, his trainers thudding down the pavement. "Wait a minute," I called, the thick air burning my lungs as I struggled to keep up. Toby whipped around, seeming concerned about both my increasingly red face and the seconds ticking away on his watch. We compromised with a brisk walk, trying to ignore the streetlights flickering on one by one. Eventually, the pavement faded into a worn-down path, with grass and dandelions creeping up out of every crack. The air began to feel still and cool. It felt as though the plant was loosening its grip on me. I'd forgotten what it was like to breathe so easily. "There," said Toby, his face flush with pride. We'd come into a clearing, surrounded by trees and covered in a lush blanket of grass. Wildflowers were dotted about, pastel shades of purple, blue and pink amidst the sea of green. The last few rays of sunlight shimmered on a bubbling stream, over which stood a quaint brick bridge. I couldn't believe the starkness of this wonderful place to Strand Street. I'd stepped out of a black and white picture and into dazzling technicolor. But the best part of all was the quiet. As Toby had promised, all that could be heard in the clearing was the soft running of the stream and the breeze blowing in the trees. "See? I told you, Charlie," he said. His face lit up with excitement. "It's nice here, isn't it?" I could have stayed there forever. We picked flowers, felt the soft grass on our toes, chucked poo sticks over the side of the bridge, and excitedly watched them sail down the stream. I felt a lightness in my chest and a sense of freedom I'd not felt since we left the city. We climbed trees, looked for fish in the brook, and watched the sun disappear down past the horizon. The sunset, the time, the rules. It had suddenly gotten very, very dark. Although the rules had become part of our DNA, it was difficult to grapple with the new and pestering longing to stay in the clearing for even 5 minutes more. "Our parents will be cross," said Toby, still looking wistfully towards the bridge. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he turned back towards me. "We'll come another day." I dropped my flowers and began ambling after Toby, back towards the grey. But as we headed back, things seemed different to how they had before. In the dark, the tree branches reached out over us like bony fingers, blotting out the last of the light. The plant's groaning started up again, snatching away the last comforting sounds of the clearing. Then there was a new sound, a rustling behind us, following us. Toby didn't say anything, but he took my little hand into his, and we walked just a half a step faster. The rustling came again, this time closer. "Let's run," Toby whispered, his voice tight with fear. As we sped up, the rustling did too. It was louder, more frantic, like a creature on the hunt. Right as the street lamps came into view, we heard it, a loud, screeching, painful sound. The thing made a screaming howl, deep and primal, that almost knocked us off our feet. This was followed by several sharp, unnatural clicks. Whatever it was big. I didn't realize I had tripped until I smacked down hard on the pavement, scraping my knees raw and narrowly avoiding taking Toby down with me. He was too panicked to speak, desperately pulling me up. It wasn't working. I was stuck in something black. It was like a thick puddle of tar, but it was moving, gliding towards us at an unnatural speed. The noises came from somewhere deep within it, shooting out of a gaping hole in its core. 2 spindly arms began to reach from the creature. The clicks and grunts were in my ear now, and the ooze was burning my feet as I tried to wiggle them free. It had just reached my knees when Toby finally gave a strong heave, and then we were back on our feet. We ran and ran and ran. Things became a blur. I remember nearly falling over the threshold in my desperate attempt to get inside. My parents slammed the door behind us, locking and bolting it, and being shoved to the ground by the thing throwing itself against the door. It wasn't finished with us yet. Toby's mum ushered us away as my parents pushed back against it. I'd been in such a rush to get inside, to get away from that thing, that I hadn't noticed what it had done to my legs. The skin on my shins had melted, sloughing off to reveal red, hot, angry patches of flesh that had soaked my shoes in blood. Toby looked down at them and started to cry. He hadn't let go of my hand. We did separate finally when Mrs. Greig began to clean the wounds, and Toby came over all faint and needed to lay down. Mrs. Greig picked fibers out of my raw flesh where my socks had melted into my skin. I tried my best to look away, but then my focus would drift to the insistent banging on the door, and I wasn't sure which was worse. I turned my attention to Mrs. Greig instead, who was now dressing my legs with all the care and precision of a surgeon. It was as if she had done this before, like she was prepared for this. Once the banging had stopped and the thing seemed to have retreated, Mrs. Greig needed to treat another casualty, my mum. She'd been leaning against the door when the same acid that got my legs had suddenly burst through the letterbox, leaving a big, searing rectangle on her shoulder. Later, Mrs. Greig pulled Toby aside and told him that his dad was missing. She explained that when he and my dad came home and found our terrified mothers unable to find us, Mr. Greig went out to search. He hadn't come back. Things were strange afterwards. My dad still smiled at me, but it never quite reached his eyes. He went to work and came home, bolting the door which had stayed shut since he left that morning. We saw the Greigs sometimes, though they mostly stayed indoors now too. I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of a tired-looking Toby rushing by, superglued to his mum's side. He wasn't the same boy I'd known before. He'd come over sometimes, following Mrs. Greig as she helped my mum and I with our healing burns, putting on a special cream that made them sting. Toby and I could never quite look at one another, though. I knew he was feeling the same guilt I was, and it had made us wary of one another, as if we knew that at any moment either of us could make a decision again that put us right back in that situation. Nobody looked for Mr. Greig. Life went on. People on the street went to work. The plant kept on chugging. Mum bought me long school trousers to wear. I tried not to itch my healing legs. I tried not to think about the clearing and how much I wanted to go there again. I felt guilty when I did want to. Toby and I moved through school, going through the motions. We eventually grew close again, but never talked about what had happened that night. We walked home from school together, chatting away happily as if we were children again, laughing without a care in the world. One day, though, I wasn't thinking, and halfway through a story about a silly thing my dad had done years ago, I looked up to see Toby's downcast face. "Sorry, Toby," I said, patting his arm. "I miss him." He sighed. "I wish we could at least talk about him, but it's—" He trailed off, nodding his head towards his door where we knew his mum was waiting. "He's still with you," I said. Toby gave a small smile before stepping inside. Over the years, things took their toll on my parents. They would wait until they thought I was asleep to argue, sometimes shouting into the early hours of the morning. I would tuck myself tight into my duvet, holding my teddy over one ear and my hand against the other to try and block out the sound, even when I had become much too old for that. Sometimes I would hear my mum shouting. On bad nights she would drag up that night about our burns and whatever had happened to Mr. Greig. My dad didn't usually have anything to say at all. It was a bad night tonight. It had been 8 years since the day we were followed home. My legs had calmed from an angry red to a scarred pink. They still ached, though, as I tiptoed out onto the landing to try and hear what my mum was shouting about. "It's not worth it, Nick. It's not worth it," she screamed. They worried less about me hearing them as I got older. Maybe I should be used to it. I still held my teddy close to my chest and tried hard to hold back the tears, feeling childish. I jumped suddenly as I heard the bolt of the door slide open, and then a hard slam. I crept down the stairs, seeing my dad alone in the hallway. "Dad!" I called out. I think because the changes had been over so many years, I didn't take much notice of them. My dad had never been the biggest man, but looking at him now, I could see how much smaller he had become. He was thin and hunched over slightly, probably from the years of labor at the plant. He'd lost his hair and spent more time coughing than talking these days. He'd lost his smile long ago. He'd lost himself then too. "She's gone," he whispered, staring past the open doorway. It took me a couple seconds to realize what that meant. My mum had gone outside at night, in the dark, where that thing would be. If my dad felt anything, it didn't show. He stood in the hall, his bony hands twitching. He didn't say anything either when I pulled on my coat and slipped past him, out the door and into the dark. It was already ink black outside. The street lamps flickered like a flame about to extinguish. I heard a slam to my left and felt my legs buckle. "Charlie!" Toby's voice shot out. He shut his door, not bothering to be quiet. Like my dad, Mrs. Grieg seemed to have given up long ago. "Toby, it's my mum. I saw her. She went down there," Toby said, gesturing towards a winding alleyway that cut through the back of the terrace row. "Come on," he said, putting on a brave face. "I'll come with you." We walked side by side down the alley, straining to listen for any sign of my mum, and hearing only the plant's screeching groans. The earth shook beneath us, making pebbles bounce against the pavement. I breathed in the sickly chemical smell, and my heart began to pound. We checked behind us every now and then, but our parents never followed. We heard a sudden splitting scream from what sounded like the next street over. My heart skipped a beat and Toby reached out, gripping my hand. We continued down the alley, and I began to hear a noise that had been echoing in my nightmares for the past 8 years. Click, 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 click. Toby's grip tightened. "It's okay," I lied, not sure who I was trying to reassure. I took a tentative step forward. I felt like I was teetering along the edge of a bear pit. The clicking sounded again, this time closer. The alleyway began to close in on us. We were going head to head with the creature again, and this time we had backed ourselves into a corner. The creature was well aware of this, taking its time to make a grand entrance. Tar began to seep along the ground, hissing and bubbling. My legs began to burn just looking at it, and as I lifted my feet to run, gallons of the stuff began to surround us. I watched it dissolve a stone in its path, and a cold dread gripped my insides as I prayed we would go quickly too once it reached us. Then its arms appeared, reaching slowly from the bubbling tar, and without warning, a face shot forward. It was so much worse than I remembered. A hideous screech tore from its throat, spraying tar which landed just a hair away from Toby's head. It rose above us, a body appearing and contorting violently before slamming down again. It crawled on its front towards us, its mangled fingers digging into the concrete. The tar slipped away for a split second, and I saw a hand that could almost be human. It was all sinew and muscle, as if the black tar was its flesh. It twisted again violently, letting out another agonized howl as tar began to surround us. Just as it twisted, more tar slipped away. A human's back appeared. The plant was screeching louder than ever. The earth shook and a deep rumbling came from inside. Heat began to radiate off of the creature, and I gagged as smoke began to fill my lungs. Toby looked over at me with a look on his face I had never seen before. Determined, resolute. He looked over at the archway behind the creature, which had widened as the tar ate up each brick it touched. He looked back at me with a faint, sad smile. "You'll be okay, Charlie," he said softly, and then he let go of my hand. I screamed when I saw him run, bouncing off the wall and landing in a puddle of tar which sizzled against his shoes. He was out of the alleyway in seconds, leaving me alone with the creature. It looked at me, the face featureless besides a twisted open mouth. It let out a final blood-curdling howl before spinning around, following Toby out of the alley and into the dark. The tar came unstuck from the ground and was swept behind the creature, taking a layer of concrete with it. Everything became blurry, and I finally let the tears fall from my eyes. I tried to listen for any sounds of Toby, any sign that he was out there, but all that echoed through the night was the rumblings of the plant as it slowed back down into its regular rhythm. I've always found it difficult to keep up with Toby. He moves a mile a minute, and so do his thoughts. I wondered for a second how he could have known that his gamble would work, that the creature would choose him instead. He must have seen what I saw too, when the creature's back was exposed, a large letterbox-shaped scar on the shoulder. I grew up in a pretty small, out-of-the-way town, one of those places where folk only stop by to ask for directions. I know that's how a lot of scary stories tend to start, but if you think about it, it's for a good reason. Before the advent of the internet, living in a remote town was like existing within your own self-contained microcosm. You wake up every day and interact with the same 20 or so people throughout your whole life. Sure, you might overhear something on the radio about what's happening around the country, but it all feels so far away, like it could never apply to you. You could debate whether ignorance is bliss, but the bottom line is, when everything outside what you're used to feels foreign and intimidating, it is all too easy to fabricate convenient ghost stories to account for the unknown. Rest assured, though, my story doesn't involve ghosts, apparitions, or anything that could be chalked up to a trick of the light. What I went through was very real and very tangible. As I neared the old sawmill, the crowns of golden leaves flanking the structure stood in stark contrast to the industrial decay, with wildflowers peeking through cracks in the pavement. The place looked as abandoned as ever, a rundown relic from another decade, with peeling paint and broken windows that seemed to stare at me blankly. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the skeletal remains of the building. My heart felt heavy, each step squishing the damp earth beneath my sneakers. Finally, I reached the spot. A simple vertically embedded plank marked the place where my best friend lay buried, and I knelt, brushing away the weeds that had tried to reclaim it. The air was thick with the scent of pine and memories. I could almost hear him running through the tall grass, chasing after something invisible. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, tracing the letters carved into the wood. "I miss you." The wind rustled the trees above, and for a moment I imagined his soft fur against my hand, his joyful spirit lingering in the quiet of the mill's ruins. I closed my eyes, feeling the ache in my chest ease just a little, as if he were still here, only to be replaced by a wave of anger I believed I had long since let go of. The memories of that day were as vivid as ever. We were playing in the yard, the sky clear and bright, his tail a blur of excitement. I had turned to grab my bike just for a moment, and in that flash, he spotted a squirrel darting across the street. I remember the way I called out, my voice lost in the rush of tires on asphalt. Panic gripped me as I turned back, watching in horror as he dashed into traffic, oblivious to the danger. The screech of brakes and a sickening thud echoed in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing back tears that threatened to spill over. "I'm sorry," I murmured, the weight of regret nearly suffocating. My fingers shook as I placed my hand on that little mound of dirt, wishing desperately I could rewind time for just one more day with him. My parents had tossed around the idea of getting me a new dog, but even after nearly a year, I just couldn't bring myself to move on. It was as if they were asking me to replace my own brother. They had no clue that I still came to visit his makeshift grave. Ever since those girls went missing here a few months back, we were no longer allowed in the old part of town. There were all kinds of theories swirling around about what could have happened. Everything from them just running away to whispers of a child killer lurking in our midst. Naturally, I thought that something like that could never happen to me. I was a big, tough boy after all, just a few days shy of my 13th birthday and already taller than my mum. In other words, I was practically invincible. The forest around me crackled with life, the trees ablaze with fiery reds and shimmering yellows, making it feel like the whole world was on fire in the best possible way. I liked autumn. Sure, school was back in session, but I didn't mind as long as it meant no more mosquitoes. To me, the trade-off was worth it. And then, amidst all the usual sounds of nature, a shrill scream sliced through the stillness like a knife. I perked up, my head snapping in the direction I thought it came from. There was a moment of silence before it echoed again, a sharp, sudden cry, unwavering in its pitch. By the third time, I was already back on my feet. In hindsight, there was definitely something off about those screams. They were too regular, almost robotic, lacking any real emotion behind them, like the indifferent wail of a car alarm. Stupidly, I decided to make my presence known. "Hello? Anyone there? Do you need help?" Silence. I took a few cautious steps toward the tree line, my heart thumping louder than the crunching of twigs beneath my feet. Even the crows had gone eerily quiet, as if they were anticipating something. Just as I was about to turn back, naively thinking that maybe I had scared off whoever was making that dreadful sound, the shrill scream cut through the air again, this time closer. My stomach dropped. I squinted into the dense thicket, My blood ran cold as I watched entire trees being violently shoved apart. Something was barreling toward me, something huge. A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. I sprinted over and dove behind the husk of a broken-down logging truck, my back pressed against its cold, rusted metal shell. Through the gaps in its decaying frame, I peered out, breath held tight in my chest. And then I saw it. A monstrous shape, casting a vast shadow as it broke free from the trees. An enormous bear, its fur matted and wild, erupted into the clearing. The sheer sight of it almost made me gasp out loud. Its paws alone were the size of tennis rackets, each thud against the earth echoing like a death knell. I could vividly imagine them stomping down on me, crushing every bone in my body into dust. But it only got worse from there. The creature paused, sniffing the air, its black eyes scanning the surroundings with alarming intelligence. Suddenly, its massive jaws opened wide, revealing not just teeth but something grotesquely horrifying. A human head lodged in its maw, its mouth still agape in a scream of unending torment. The bear's growls mingled with the cries, fusing in a chilling duet that sent waves of nausea through me. The head, with its hollow eyes and skin drained of color, looked resigned to its fate, an abominable marionette in the throes of its own suffering. The detachment in its expression as it shrieked for help terrified more than any frantic plea could have. Tears clouded my vision. This was it, I thought. Soon, it would be my head there, trapped in an endless limbo of reliving the last moments before that creature tore me apart. I couldn't outrun it. I was almost sure of that. And it was only a matter of time before it discovered my hiding spot. My breathing quickened. I patted my pockets, as if searching for something with which to make my final stand. Instead, I found the granola bar I had tucked there earlier. I swallowed hard. It was worth a shot. With as much steadiness as my fingers would allow, I peeled back the packaging, feeling like a pinned-down soldier about to toss his last grenade at the encroaching enemy. I didn't see where it landed, but the rustle of the nearby bushes gave me a hint of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, it would divert the monster's attention, if only for a fleeting moment. Fortunately, it did, as I witnessed it lumber off toward the source of the disturbance, accompanied by wet, snorting noises. I didn't linger to witness whether it showed any real interest in the food itself. Instead, I proceeded to try and sneak away toward the edges of the glade, each cautious step an exercise in self-control, as every fiber of my being urged me to run. I risked a glance over my shoulder. A shudder ran down my spine. There it was, a hulking mass of fur and muscle, its attention momentarily diverted, but probably not for long. I gathered every morsel of courage left within me and took another tentative step, moving slowly, praying that the tall grass would be enough to shield me from its sight. It wasn't. Suddenly, it lifted its massive skull, and in a single heart-stopping moment, its black eyes locked onto mine. Time creeped to halt. All sense of composure evaporated like mist in the sun, and before I could think, a raw, primal scream erupted from my throat. Panic ignited my legs, propelling me in the opposite direction. I tore through the underbrush, branches raking at my exposed arms and ankles. With every frantic stride, I forced myself to focus on the path ahead, but there was no ignoring the guttural roars that reverberated through my very bones. The trees above towered like silent sentinels, as I zigzagged between their trunks, desperate to confuse my pursuer. Whether it worked or not, I had no intention of slowing down to find out, but the sounds of snapping bark made it clear the creature was more than capable of carving its own path. Through the kaleidoscope of autumn colors that blurred past me, my eyes caught sight of a distant sliver of gray, the back road that twisted its way through the woods, connecting the old parts of town to the highway. Not many people still used it, but it was the only glimmer of hope I had. I swerved sharply and took off toward it, my calves screaming in protest. Behind me, the heavy thuds grew louder, closer, so close I could almost feel the beast's hot breath on my neck. I burst onto the road, tripping over my own feet, but managing to roll back upright just in time to keep moving. A group of bikers clad in leather stood clustered beside their rumbling machines, their laughter ringing out in stark contrast to the horror I was desperately trying to evade. Their banter ceased as they registered my presence. I could barely process the sight of their confused faces, too out of breath to even cry out for help. Understandably concerned, two of the men crossed the road over to my side, which ended up being the biggest mistake of their lives. In an instant, the giant bear, or whatever the hell it was, came crashing onto the scene. My instincts kicked in. I ducked between them, inadvertently positioning the pair between the creature and myself. They, on the other hand, had zero time to react. One man, a shade luckier than the other, was smacked aside like a rag doll, his body bouncing off the tarmac. The other found himself pinned mercilessly to the ground. I caught glimpses of the monster's gaping maw descending upon him. With a sickening crunch, it clamped down on the man's face, then wrenched its head back, tearing his jaw clean off in a brutal display of raw power. Blood blossomed from the gruesome mess. It sprayed the air like a fountain as he writhed beneath the creature, his screams distorted into grotesque, gurgling sounds that finally compelled me to avert my gaze. "Move it, kid!" a young woman with long dreadlocks yelled. I looked up and saw her extending a gloved hand towards me while mounting her silvery steed. She pulled me up with surprising strength, and I wrapped my arms around her waist, clinging on for dear life. The bike rattled beneath us, tires skimming against the tarmac as we took off. "Keep your head down!" she shouted, glancing back briefly, her dreadlocks whipping like frenzied serpents in the wind. She didn't have to tell me twice. I buried my face in the back of her jacket. I remember it smelled like a mix of lavender and mint. I was too exhausted to cry. All I could think about was how much trouble I was going to be in when my parents found out where I'd been. Maybe it was just my brain's way of dealing with the guilt and trauma. Regardless, I was alive. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. Few from the town believed my story, which was hardly surprising. I definitely didn't help my case by mentioning the part about the bear having a second human head popping out of its mouth. I never really saw my savior again. She just dropped me off near my house and literally rode off into the sunset. I couldn't really blame her. The poor girl was probably just as traumatized by what she had witnessed as I was. Days turned into weeks, then months, and eventually years. I found myself drifting through the motions of life in our sleepy town, haunted by the memories of that day. And yet, life has a way of pushing you forward, whether you like it or not. One afternoon, while walking home from school, I took a secluded path through the woods, a route I usually avoided ever since the encounter. Hopeful sunbeams filtered through the canopy, and despite the chill that still raced through my veins, at the thought of what lay within those shadows, there was an undeniable urge to reclaim that space, to prove that I would not be defined by fear. The old sawmill still stood, albeit barely, most of it reclaimed by nature. There was now a small birch tree growing on top of my best friend's grave. I don't know why, but it made me smile. Intense night doing urbex. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but definitely the creepiest night of my life. For context, I'm James, M21, and with my cousins Ethan, M23, and Alex, M19, we went urban exploring. This was our third time doing urbex, and it happened last week. I want to document how strange this whole ordeal was, so I'm writing this down. It was quite a warm day, so we packed a large amount of water. I remember seeing the 12 bottles Alex had put in the Ethan's camper van before we left, along with a pack of Marlboro cigarettes and some beers to get through the heat. The drive was far longer than our previous urbex trips, and I noticed the change of environment as the route only seemed to get more desolate. Once we arrived, Ethan parked the van in a shaded area by some trees. It was a broad building and visibly worn. I thought it was really cool and probably going to be our most interesting trip. We walked in the building and split up for a while. Personally, I wanted to find leftover belongings or something I could sell, but I know Ethan was here for the exploring. I met back with Alex and he showed me an elevator. It looked like an older form of elevator with bars in front of it, almost boxed off. But now we knew there was a lower level. We both wanted to find it before Ethan, as Ethan usually discovers the interesting stuff. I see a door close by and open it to show a large flight of stairs which leads downwards underneath the building. Alex calls Ethan, and we walk down the passage of stairs which only seem to get darker. In the moment I could feel Alex's warm breath on the back of my neck. I said to him, "Alex, you're too close." He replied, "Turn around." When I turned around, Alex seemed to be at least 3 feet away from me. That left me slightly surprised. I do have claustrophobia, so I brushed it off. During such a hot day, suddenly it felt rather cold. The further we went, the smaller the passage seemed to get, making our footsteps sound slightly louder as we descended. In the moment I thought I could hear a 4th person's footsteps coming down after us. Ethan suddenly stopped. "Is something wrong?" I asked him, and to my shock he replied, "Just an echo, I suppose," before continuing further. I suddenly realized he had heard the exact same footsteps as me. I actually wasn't imagining it. I looked back and realized Alex seemed pale. "Are you all right, Alex?" I asked, hoping he would confirm hearing other footsteps, but he simply said, "I'm fine," and continued walking, which really fucked with me. Maybe it really was just an echo, and I was overreacting. I just continue walking until we come to a halt. I don't know what this building was previously used for, but it reminded me of a parking lot. Large, empty space with racks of some sort lined across it. Ethan brought up the absolutely fucking brilliant idea of splitting up to search for interesting things. I nervously snapped back with "Alex, stick with me." It definitely felt colder, but much more quiet, without the echoing sound of footsteps down a corridor. We slowly tried out best to search the racks in darkness, for a couple of minutes before I heard a very small piercing sound through the air. Around some racks near us it sounded so much like wheezing, like deep breathing. I knew Ethan had asthma, so I whispered lightly across the racks. "Ethan, do you need your inhaler?" No response. "Ethan, I have your inhaler if you need it." Still no Ethan. Alex shouted, "Ethan, where are you?" "I'm over here, calm down." The sudden horror crept in as we both realized Ethan was at the other end of the hall. I looked back at Alex and I say to him, "I don't feel great. Let's go." He responded with, "Ethan, we're heading back now, let's go." I actually ran towards the corridor, and since it was dark, I hit my foot against the first step, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I actually fractured my foot because of this, but the adrenaline made it feel like nothing. I ran up the stairs. Our running definitely shook Ethan, since we could hear him begin to run back to the entrance as well. As soon as I made it to the top, I just dashed outside and towards the van. I turned around and realized Alex was choking. I ran back and hit his back violently. He coughed up a lit cigarette he had swallowed. We made it to the van and jumped straight in. Nobody wanted to mention how tense the moment was, but I could tell Alex was stressed. By now he had smoked 8 cigarettes already, and the pack was crumpled from his clenching. I regret leaving Ethan, but at the time adrenaline was my only sense of reasoning. Finally, Ethan walks out looking incredibly pissed. He gets in the van and slams the door. "How about my fucking inhaler, Alex?" he said, while wheezing. After this incident, I didn't know what to think. Here I am writing this down at midnight. I know I won't be able to sleep without a lamp on. Am I being paranoid? Life out here ain't ever been easy. My family's worked this land for generations, and every year it's a gamble. You do everything right. Plow the fields, plant the seeds, and pray to God you don't lose it all to a storm or drought. But this year was the worst I've seen. No rain for months, the sun burning my crops to dust. I've got 3 kids to feed, and a wife who looks at me every night like I'm failing them. I started praying more than usual, asking for a miracle, begging. Really, I ain't one to go to church much, but when you're desperate, you try anything. One morning I'm walking the fields like always, checking for any sign of life. The air was still, the sun barely up, when I noticed something strange. One of the stalks was bulging, like it was too full, but not with corn. I got closer and saw the husk wasn't sealed right, like something was pushing through from the inside. I reached out, hesitating for a second before pulling it open. And there it was, a human hand, pale and perfect, sticking out from the cob like it had grown there. My heart jumped up into my throat. I stumbled back. eyes wide, the bile rising as I tried to make sense of it. The hand twitched slightly on the stalk. I pulled more of the husk apart, my hands shaking, and what I saw almost sent me running for the hills. Fingers, arms, legs, even a foot, all tangled up in the stalks like some grotesque harvest. And it wasn't just one plant, there were more. Dozens. They weren't growing corn anymore. They were growing people, or pieces of them at least. Some stalks had kidneys nestled in the leaves, others had hearts or lungs just hanging there, red and slick like fresh meat in a butcher shop. I threw up right there in the dirt, bile burning my throat. This wasn't natural, it wasn't right. But then I thought about my family, my bills piling up, the look in my kids' eyes when they went to bed hungry. Maybe this was the answer to my prayers. After a few days of staring at those body parts sprouting like crops, an idea crept into my mind. At first I pushed the thought away, but it wouldn't leave me. Desperation changes a man. I made the call. They didn't ask many questions. I made more money in one sale than in the past 5 years. People were desperate for organs, and no one cared where they came from. The fields kept producing, and the buyers, the fewer questions the better. Before I knew it, I'd paid off the farm, the debts, everything. My kids had new clothes, my wife was smiling again. But every night when I close my eyes, I see them, those pieces of people growing, and I wonder if God really heard me, or if I made a deal with someone else. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.